She didn't just complain about my parking sign, she stole it. And that single mistake turned into the most ridiculous neighborhood showdown I've ever experienced. It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning when I walked outside, coffee in hand, ready to head to work. I glanced toward my driveway and froze. The custom parking sign I'd installed just a week earlier was gone. Not knocked over. Not damaged. Gone. The metal pole was still there, cleanly unscrewed, like it had never existed. For a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. Then I remembered the argument. The day before, Karen had stormed over while I was installing the sign. Clipboard tucked under her arm, lips pursed tight. She claimed the sign was aggressive, that it made her feel unwelcome, and that it violated the spirit of the neighborhood. I politely explained it was legal, approved, and installed only because people kept blocking my driveway. She didn't like that answer. Standing there now, staring at the empty pole, I knew exactly who had taken it. I walked the block, scanning yards, garages, anywhere it might have ended up. Then I saw it, leaning casually against the side of Karen's garage, my sign partially hidden behind a trash bin. My name was still printed on it. There was no denying it. She hadn't even bothered to be subtle. I knocked on her door. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. The sign stayed right where it was, like a trophy. That was the moment something snapped. This wasn't about parking anymore. This was about control. Instead of calling the HOA, filing a complaint, or demanding it back, I went home and sat down at my computer. I read every bylaw, every local ordinance, every rule about signage. And buried deep in the city code, I found something beautiful. Something legal. Something big. If Karen thought a small parking sign was a problem, she had no idea what was coming next. By the end of the day, I wasn't angry anymore. I was inspired. She wanted the sign gone. Fine. I'd remove it. But I'd replace it with something so visible, so undeniable, that she'd never forget the day she decided to steal from me. And this time, the whole neighborhood would see it. That night, I barely slept. My laptop stayed open on the kitchen table, city codes highlighted, HOA rules bookmarked, coffee reheated more times than I could count. What started as curiosity quickly turned into strategy. If Karen wanted to play rule enforcer, then I was going to learn the rules better than she ever had. The HOA bylaws were predictable. Signage restrictions, aesthetic guidelines, vague language about community harmony. Nothing new. But the city ordinances were different. They were specific, measurable, clear. And that's where I struck gold. Buried in a section about temporary structures and permitted displays was a clause allowing large format signage on private property for personal messaging, as long as it met setback requirements and didn't obstruct traffic visibility. There was no mention of size limits, no restriction on height, no requirement for HOA approval, just permits, fees, and compliance. I read it 3 times to be sure. Then I smiled. If Karen had returned my parking sign, this story would have ended there. But she didn't. She crossed a line. And now, the solution wasn't just retaliation. It was escalation, wrapped neatly in legality. The next morning, I drove to the city office with documents printed and organized. The clerk barely looked up as she stamped my application. "You're allowed," she said casually. "Just make sure it's installed safely." Allowed. By lunchtime, I had quotes from 3 sign companies. One offered vinyl banners. Another suggested metal panels. The third paused when I explained what I wanted, then laughed and said, "You want a billboard?" Yes. Yes, I did. By the end of the day, the order was placed. Tall steel supports. Weatherproof panels. Lighting rated for night visibility. Fully compliant. Fully permitted. Entirely ridiculous. Karen still had my parking sign propped against her garage. I saw it every time I passed her house. She waved once, smug, convinced she'd won. I waved back, calm, knowing she had no idea what was about to rise in my yard. Neighbors started asking questions when the city marked underground lines with bright paint across my lawn. I told them it was a project. They didn't press. Rumors spread anyway. People whispered about renovations, fences, additions. No one guessed the truth. As the installation date approached, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not revenge. Anticipation. Because soon, Karen wouldn't be able to ignore me. She wouldn't be able to hide my message behind a trash bin. She'd see it every day. The installation truck arrived early Saturday morning, long before most of the neighborhood was awake. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching as workers unloaded steel beams and massive panels onto my lawn. The sound alone was enough to draw attention. Doors creaked open. Curtains shifted. Curious faces peeked out, trying to understand what was happening. Karen noticed immediately. She marched out of her house in slippers and a robe, eyes wide as she took in the scene. "What is this?" she shouted, storming toward my yard. One of the workers paused, clearly unsure whether to respond. I stepped forward calmly and said, "It's permitted. You can check with the city." That stopped her cold. She pulled out her phone and started making calls, pacing back and forth like a general losing a battle. Meanwhile, the workers continued. Holes were drilled. Supports were anchored. The framework rose higher and higher, towering above the fences like a monument to poor decisions. Neighbors gathered in small groups, pretending to walk dogs or check mail while openly staring. A few of them recognized me and smirked, already sensing something legendary was unfolding. When the main panel was finally lifted into place, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The billboard faced the street perfectly. It was clean, bold, impossible to ignore. Karen let out a noise somewhere between a gasp and a scream. "You can't do that," she yelled, pointing at it like it might disappear if she accused it hard enough. I simply held up the permit paperwork. She didn't even look. She just turned redder by the second. By the time the workers finished bolting everything down, Karen had exhausted every threat in her vocabulary. HOA fines, complaints, emergency meetings. None of it mattered. This wasn't HOA territory. This was city-approved reality. When the crew finally left, the neighborhood stood silent, staring at the towering structure now living in my yard. Some neighbors clapped. One person actually laughed out loud. Karen retreated to her porch. Instead, she had inspired something enormous. That evening, the billboard lights flicked on for the first time. It illuminated the streets softly, legally, beautifully. People drove by slower than usual. Some even rolled down their windows. Karen closed her blinds. But the story wasn't over yet. By the next morning, the billboard was the talk of the block. Cars slowed as they passed my house. People stopped to snap photos. Even local delivery drivers paused, leaning out their windows to get a better look. The sheer scale of it made a small parking sign look laughable by comparison. It was impossible to ignore, and impossible for Karen to control. She emerged from her house mid-morning, sunglasses shielding her eyes, her arms crossed like she was ready to wage war. But something had shifted. The reactions of the neighbors had changed the dynamic. Instead of whispers of disapproval, murmurs of admiration floated through the street. One neighbor called out, "Wow, that's impressive." Another laughed, saying, "Finally, someone did it right." Karen's face paled. The rules were on my side, and the community clearly appreciated the bold move. Even the HOA couldn't ignore it. Later that day, I received a formal letter congratulating me on proper permitting and compliance. The irony was delicious. Every complaint Karen had filed or threatened to file was rendered completely ineffective. My legal, city-approved billboard now had the power of public support, turning her anger into quiet frustration. Every time she tried to approach me, I calmly reminded her, all permits are valid. The city approved it. Her protests fizzled in the face of legitimacy and community applause. The billboard itself was more than just a giant parking sign replacement. It became a statement, a symbol that petty control could be countered with creativity, careful planning, and a little audacity. It wasn't just about reclaiming my driveway. It was about sending a message to everyone who thought they could bully neighbors into submission. And for once, the message was impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, the block changed subtly but significantly. Kids would ride by on scooters, pointing and laughing at Karen's muttered complaints. Drivers would wave at me, offering thumbs-up gestures. Even the mailman paused, shaking his head in amusement. The billboard had become a landmark, a conversation starter, and a victory monument all at once. Karen's attempts to regain control only made her appear smaller. She'd mutter under her breath and stomp her feet, but she couldn't erase the community, admiration, or the literal tower of legitimacy in my yard. And as I sipped coffee on my porch that morning, looking up at the billboard basking in sunlight, I realized this wasn't just revenge. It was proof that strategy, legality, and creativity together could turn the tiniest stolen sign into a triumph too big for anyone to ignore. By the weekend, the billboard had become the unspoken centerpiece of the neighborhood. Passers-by stopped to gawk, snapping pictures, sharing them on social media, and tagging friends. Comments ranged from admiration to disbelief. "That's bold. Did she really do that?" Legendary. It was more than a sign now. It was a statement of defiance, a monument to the fact that petty HOA antics could be countered with cleverness, planning, and a bit of audacity. Karen, of course, did not appreciate the attention. She sat on her porch, scowling, clipboard abandoned at her side. Every glance at the towering structure made her wince. Her attempts to rally other neighbors against it fell flat. Most people were laughing or taking pictures, and a few even waved at me in quiet solidarity. I could see the defeat settling in behind her sunglasses. Her authority was gone, replaced by humor, admiration, and a giant city-approved billboard. The sign she had stolen? Still leaning harmlessly against her garage, a small reminder of her initial audacity. I hadn't returned it to my yard. I didn't need it. The billboard was bigger, brighter, and far more impactful. It had drawn attention, garnered support, and made an indelible point. Small acts of pettiness can be met with proportional, creative responses. And I had delivered in spades. Neighbors began stopping by to chat. One brought cookies. Another complimented the design. Even the local paper's photographer showed up, curious about the story behind the massive structure dominating a previously quiet street. It was surreal, watching the entire block turn a petty feud into something communal, almost celebratory. The billboard had unintentionally united the neighborhood, all while making a point that Karen could never counter. By Monday, the HOA sent a formal acknowledgement stating that all city codes were followed and no further complaints would be entertained. Karen read it, muttered under her breath, and went back inside. Her reign of minor terror was officially over. The billboard stood tall, a permanent victory on full display. As I sat on my porch that evening, sipping coffee and watching birds circle the street, I realized this was more than a story about a stolen parking sign. It was a lesson in patience, creativity, and strategy. Petty behavior doesn't have to win. Planning, legality, and a little imagination can turn even the smallest injustice into something impossible to ignore. And the best part? Every time Karen looks at that billboard, she remembers exactly who holds the upper hand. Victory had never looked so large, so legal, and so satisfying. The end.